Is sponsored by JMR Rentals, professional digital cinema and broadcast rentals in Brooklyn, New York. To find out more, visit their website, jmrny.com. Hello and welcome to No Rest for the Weekend, where we go behind the scenes and talk to the creators of independent entertainment. I'm Jason Godbey, and joining me via Zoom today, she is the director of the documentary The Heir of the Time, Miss Julie Rowen. Welcome, Julie.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming, or thanks for being there. You're on the left coast,
I am.
on the other side of the world, where it's much earlier. I always assume that, if it's 8 o'clock out here, it's 1968 out there. But anyway, it's an old joke. Anyway, I want to talk to you about The Heir of the Time. But I also want to talk, before we get into that, I want to talk to you a little bit about you. Like, how did you get into filmmaking? What's your origin story, so to speak?
I grew up in St. Louis and I started working in commercials. And then the commercial company I was working with moved to Chicago. And when I moved to Chicago, I started working with a director named John Hughes. And John Hughes then did a movie called Planes, Trains, and Automobiles that ended up shooting in Los Angeles. So I went from St. Louis to Chicago to Los Angeles. And then once I was in Los Angeles, I met a director, Ron Howard, and I worked for Ron for many years and for his company for many years before I then started doing my own thing.
So you managed to work for, were you like 12 when this
Yeah.
was happening? They kidnapped you as a child and had you work. So you worked for the great John Hughes.
I did.
Planes, Trains, and Automobile, but he also, he's famous for Pretty in Pink and The Breakfast Club. And I'm saying this for the younger audience who might not know John Hughes. John Hughes, and then you also worked with Ron Howard. Doing what? What were you doing there?
I started working with Ron. I was hired to work with a writer to develop a film called Far and Away. And that was the first film that I did with Ron. And then from then on, I did development, I did research, I started, worked for him for a number of years and then started producing on my own.
Working in development, I'm sure you saw a lot of projects come and go, because development in Hollywood is like, there's stuff that gets developed and it's produced, and there's a lot of things that get developed and don't. Was that kind of, when you saw that, because you're working in the Hollywood system, basically, I'm going to guess, say maybe there was a little frustration there that kind of led you to go more on your own and do your own thing?
Well, I was lucky enough to be working with Ron on his films. So we were developing films for him to go, films that he knew he wanted to do. So that was sort of a different kind of development. It was usually, in the room with a writer working on the script, either from an idea or from a book or something, that was sent to him. And then you would develop it with him into something that we would then go make. So for me, it was ideal because I would come on the project at the idea point or the script point and then follow it all the way through production. So that was such a great experience for me and a great learning experience. And both those directors, I just learned so much from. They're great men, both of them.
Bringing us to the present, The Heir of the Time. So is this your first feature, or had you directed other things before this?
I have not directed anything before, and I knew the story. I sort of developed the story that I wanted to do with The Heir of the Time, and I felt strong about a woman directing it. And when I thought about who could direct that, I had such a specific view of visually of this story that I wanted to tell. So it seemed like something that I should go and do. So that's how I chose to direct it.
So, and for those who haven't seen it or didn't see our previous interview, because we interviewed you at Soho, give me like the log line, like the Hollywood log line for Heir of the Time.
So The Heir of the Time is a documentary about iconic women fashion designers over the past 100 years. I was interested in the time period between 1920 and 2020. I was interested in that, in our history, and how that history told really the journey of a woman decade to decade. And specifically, I wanted to focus on the women fashion designers and how their journey happened, specifically starting with Coco Chanel in 1920, how she managed to open a boutique and do it at a time when women couldn't vote and they didn't have the right to own their property. And somehow she was, starting this brand that is relevant today. So that was sort of how it started. And then I became interested in the other women designers throughout those decades.
So that's really interesting, and I think that's a key time period because, and especially to focus on women designers, because the history of fashion, it's the history of men dressing women, and there's still, obviously there's still big names in fashion, both men and women, but to go from 1920, obviously that's the year that women get to vote, until present when I guess we're lucky women still have the right to vote with the way things are going. But specifically, what designers did you, so you started with Chanel, but I'm assuming that you talked to some people who are currently alive
Yes.
and so who did you talk to?
So we have Diane von Furstenberg and Carolina Herrera and Donna Karan and Gabriella Hearst and Hanako Maeda, who takes us through to the present day. And then we have a few male designers that sort of give their perspective and their insights, Johnson Hardig and Tony Melillo. And then we have the editor from Vogue, Hamish Bowles, and Bergdorf Goodman, and a few other people that come in and sort of help us tell the story of women throughout the years.
In doing this documentary, obviously all these folks, because I'm a New Yorker and we're very fashion centric here. And I was telling you before we rolled, I used to work in the fashion industry. These people are not the most accessible usually. So how were you, in terms of the challenges of the job and making this film, sort of how many months, years are we talking to make it? And how were you able to get to some of these folks?
It's a good question. I had this idea. I knew who I wanted, and I really wanted the women that I said. But I thought, well, what if nobody wants to know? What if no one's interested? And I contacted Carolina Herrera and Bergdorf Goodman were the first two people that we sort of went out to just to test the water. And they both said yes. And once Carolina Herrera was on board, it sort of said to the other designers, this is sort of the level of which the designer we're looking for. And the same thing with Bergdorf Goodman. So many of these designers got their start at Bergdorf Goodman, and they really opened their doors to us. And as well as the designers did, they opened their ateliers and they told their stories personally and professionally. And they really opened up about their struggles and how they got started. And
did you have any experience, because you came from, you're a Midwesterner who got whisked off to LA by
mm-hmm.
Hollywood. Did you have any experience in the fashion world before?
I didn't. I was interested in the fashion world, and in the film business, you deal with costume designers. So in the film business, there is some overlap between the fashion world and the music world and the film world. So I knew a little bit about the fashion world, but I had never done sort of a deep dive into fashion like this.
We used to say it's the one business that's crazier than show business, because it's crazy people making product for other crazy people. It's and there are definitely, let's call them, personalities in the business that you encounter. Was there kind of a, like, because you were talking about, and I could see how this would work, because fashion's a very trendy thing and everybody once something's cool, they want to do it. So like you start your trend by getting like sort of one big fish in the boat, and then you can kind of reel the rest in. Did you meet with any resistance? People who didn't want to talk, or uh, did you get some good gossip on people? It's because they all know each other, you
Um,
know.
no, that's interesting. To your point, the fashion world is very much like the film world in the sense that there's groups of people that all know each other, and particularly the group that sort of rises to the top. And what was great was having one person come on board. You sort of follow that thread that leads you to that next person. So you know, once you had somebody, then that sort of led to somebody else. So I just kept following that thread. But no, thankfully everybody said yes, which was surprising and wonderful.
And how long is this taking? Like, are you doing this for 6 months or 3 years, or how long are you doing it for?
It took 2 years, and I think the reason why it took 2 years was, you know, I knew the women that I wanted to interview, and waiting to get those interviews with those women, you had to be patient. So I think that's a big part of documentary filmmaking, which is so different than, you know, on a regular film you have a schedule and you go shoot that schedule, and on a documentary film, you know, those people aren't on my schedule, they're on their own busy schedule. And I think, you know, waiting for that get with them was, you know, was worth the wait.
And during this, are you all the time in New York? Are you flipping back to New York and LA?
I would fly to New York, and I would do an interview, and I would shoot the exteriors in New York, and I'd shoot, you know, inside their studios and their ateliers and their offices. I'd meet with their archivist, and I would go through all of, they opened up um, current, you know, runway and fashion photos. They opened up their personal photos to us. So that was, so it was 2 years, but it wasn't 2 years of waiting. There was a lot of archival footage to go through in that time. So I would really sort of hone in on one person and really, you know, go through all of their stuff, and then another interview would pop up.
Yeah, so much. I mean, so much of filmmaking in general, but especially for documentaries, it's you have to gather all of this material, and then you have to put it together. And this is your first doc, right? That you
Yes.
do. So, I'm sure that was fun, going through all of that material. But was there once you got the process, like once you sort of uh, uh, gardened and picked out all the fruit that you wanted, how was it bringing that together? Like, and how were you able to, like, did you have a few different editors and you were kind of cross cut Donna Karan with Carolina and Coco Chanel? Like, how did you kind of structure it? Because I think that's hard. I think it's like probably one of the most difficult processes.
Yes. Well, I knew the story that I wanted to tell. So I knew the questions that I wanted to ask each one of the designers so that their stories would fit together. And also with these women, you get a very specific amount of time. So you have to do a lot of research, and you have to be very prepared when you go in. Um, and then I would read the transcripts, and I would look at all the footage. And before I went into the editing room, I knew the story I wanted to tell, and I knew the images that I wanted to go in. So when I was in the editing room, it wasn't a lot about looking through footage as much as it was to sit with the editor and piece different cuts together to make sure that it worked the way I hoped it would work.
I think that's a big thing. And, there's sort of these different methods of making docs. And one is the kind of like, let's shoot everything and then make the movie in post. And some people do that. Some people have been on the show and talked about doing that. I talked to a guy who made a documentary where he interviewed these migrant girls coming up from South America. And he just took off with a little camera and went down there and like stayed in hotels and interviewed people, didn't speak Spanish, but just gathered a ton of footage. And then, came back, and with his team, they put it together after getting it translated. And I was just like, oh God, I would never want to do that. I'm more of your school, like, know what you want the person to say, or know what points of the story you're driving at, and then go and get those points, because you're right. You're not going to have 3 days of interviewing with Donna Karan. You're going to get it for like an hour. And how are you going to do that in an hour? And you can't fish. It's not a deposition. It's a cross-examination kind of thing. Once you had all that together, were you sitting with an editor? Did you have multiple editors? What was your kind of relationship there in terms of working with that person? Were you kind of like, here, this is what I want, and then you go away for a while and come back, or were you sitting with them and working shoulder to shoulder kind of thing?
On this, I was sitting with them working shoulder to shoulder, because I would go through all the footage before I came and sat down. So I really knew, what I wanted it to be. And then he made it better. He, that was sort of the crafting of honing in on the story and honing in on, having the images, be something that really supported what the person was saying. So creatively, we had a real rhythm, and that was great. But we were together in the editing room for this particular project.
How much different was the project? Did it finish than when you started? Like, what was in terms of when you had a vision for it? How different was it when you ended? And what, if any, advice would Julie now go back and tell Julie then at the start, having seen what happens?
It's pretty close to what I wanted it to be. I think for me, the surprise, people always talk about the surprise in a story. I had the benefit of being able to watch interviews with all these people. So I knew what they talked about. I knew a lot of their stories. I knew what I wanted them to say. But the surprise for me was I would ask them, prompt them to tell a story. They would start to tell a story. And with in their professional life, they're very on point with their stories. But then they would start to tell a story that maybe I hadn't heard before, or, tell more of a story or back up in that story. And then the real surprise came when I would ask them personal questions, because then they would really settle into a dialogue, and I became very engaged. And, that was sort of the surprise. I didn't expect them to be so giving in that sense.
And is there anything that, if you could go back in time, that you would tell yourself at the start of the process?
Be patient. Be patient. Don't give up. Don't, we locked pictures several times, assuming that we were finished, and we weren't. Meaning something else would come in and that made it better and was worth going back in. So I think that, it's a process that you can't control really in documentary filmmaking in the way you can control a film. So I think that was the learning for me.
And having worked alongside guys like Ron Howard and John Hughes, was there stuff did they give you any advice when you were coming up? Did you learn anything about directing from them that was kind of like, oh, you know what, he does this, so I'm going to steal that? Or are there any nuggets that you could give other directors if you don't want to keep them all to yourself?
John Hughes, I was so young, and it was the first time on a movie set, so I was just watching everything that he did. But I think the takeaway from John Hughes was how he used music in all of his movies. And that was a big part of it. And so when I was doing the documentary, music was a big, I was always thinking about that and how that would play in the documentary and how important that is. And with Ron is such a good storyteller. So it's always about going back to what is the story that you're trying to tell. And I think whether you're doing a film or a documentary, it really is, what is the story that you're trying to share with somebody? You might have, like with fashion, you might have this beautiful background and these interesting people, but what's the story that's going to really grab somebody?
In speaking to that, was there something that you were, you were working on this stuff? You get all this material, right? And you're trying to whittle it down to an hour and a half, 2 hour movie, whatever it is. Was there anything that you kind of used as a touchstone that if you ever got off or veered away from the subject matter or the theme, you could say, wait a minute, it's about this, and this is the theme that I want to hang on to, or this is the hook that I want to keep the audience in with? Was there anything like that for you?
Yes, I think I kept coming back to this notion of somebody creating something out of nothing. That you have this idea and what inspired this idea. And for these women, they created these global brands based on a single idea. And what were the struggles that they had along the way? And when men watched the documentary, I was most surprised that they came back and said that that was their takeaway, that they were really engaged by it because that's what it was about to them. Like how and it didn't matter that that it was a woman. It didn't matter that it was a fashion designer. It was about creating something from nothing. And that really sort of, was the hook for them. And for younger girls, I think it was really a mentoring masterclass experience for them. So those two takeaways, I think, were important, and I'm happy that it has sort of resonated that way with people.
Well, that's kind of like a metaphor for film too, like taking that, starting with a nebulous idea and then putting it together. Was there something that you kind of learned from them? And did you learn anything by watching them, the way they conducted business or the way they spoke? Was there anything that you said, oh, you know what, that's a good thing for me in my career as well?
Definitely. A couple things. One, their attention to detail in every aspect of everything that they do, whether it's writing an email, whether it's the look of something, whether it's sitting down to do an interview. They are focused, they are on point, and they work really, really hard. They're really an inspiring group.
Very cool. So right now, we talked to you at Soho. So you're doing the festival circuit. Kind of where are you now in the process, and what are the hopes going forward for the film? Like, where would you like to see this film end up?
Soho was our first festival, which is exciting, and it was a great festival and a great experience. And hopefully we'll do more festivals. And we are looking for distribution. So my hope is that this film finds its audience and finds a broader audience, that yes, it will hopefully appeal to people who are interested in fashion, but that it'll have even a broader appeal beyond that.
Excellent. So for people who want to know more about you or more about the film, where can they find you guys on the web?
You can find us on Instagram at the Air of the Time, and you can send me messages there, and I will definitely respond back.
Julie, thanks so much. We had a pleasure meeting you at Soho, even virtually, but we're glad that, you could do this. If you have any other projects, definitely let us know, and definitely update us. So if you guys you got picked, if you get distributed anywhere, send us a press release, and we'll put it on the website. But thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
And that's all we have time for today. Thanks so much for taking this trip down the rabbit hole. For more of our content, including our movie reviews, visit our website, norestfortheweekendpodcast.com. Don't forget to like, rate, and subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Once again, I'd like to thank my guest, Julie Rowen, and I'd like to thank the good folks over at JMR Rentals for sponsoring this episode. For Behind the Rabbit Productions, I'm Jason Godbey. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.